You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm speaking with Lucy Vanel, a culinary instructor based in Lyon. She's here to discuss a term that translates to cork or even traffic jam elsewhere in France, but in Lyon evokes a very specific sort of restaurant and way of life. Bouchon. Welcome, Lucy, to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, Emily, thank you for having me.
So I would love if you could just, for anyone who isn't familiar with your work already, just tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do here in France.
Okay, my name is Lucy Vanel. I'm a cooking teacher, and I teach both market classes and pâtisserie. I'm a pâtissière by professional formation, and I give my classes in Lyon, France, and that's about it.
Amazing. And I mean, I love the city of Lyon. I think anybody who hasn't been to Lyon absolutely needs to go. And one thing that I loved so much about eating in Lyon, and obviously Lyon's culinary scene does not boil down to this, but there is one sort of very classic element that we're going to chat about, and that's this word Bouchon. Now, before we get to the real Lyonnais meaning behind this, the word Bouchon, like so many words in French, has a lot of meanings. One is related to traffic, one is related to wine, and one is related to restaurants.
Right, exactly.
So can you take us through those meanings?
Sure. When you get stuck in a traffic jam, you're in a bouchon. That's the word for traffic jam. Another meaning is a wine cork. You know, what's blocking the bottle closed is a bouchon.
Mm-hmm.
So in Lyon, we have a restaurant called a bouchon, and it comes from a different word, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. Bouchon has another meaning. The verb bouchonner, it's coming from that word. And what does it mean, bouchonner? It means to briskly brush, used to describe, for example, the act of grooming an animal. So, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So the name for a bouchon came from the fact that you can leave your horse to be brushed down during your stay at an inn where they're serving certain kinds of food. And the identifying factor of this restaurant was that it had a bouchon of straw that was hung outside to transmit the fact that you could have this service done.
Okay. So my mind, of course, is blown because I was convinced that it had to do with wine corks. And obviously, bouchonner also in French means like a corked. So like your wine is corked. It's
exactly.
Bouchonner, but completely different origins. Why? Pourquoi faire simple quand on peut faire compliqué in French?
Exactly. So it's a multifaceted word as well. And, you know, Lyon is basically a place that has this sort of subculture of the bon vivant. So it is natural to kind of lean towards this idea that that's where, you know, bouchon comes from. It comes from wine cork, but actually it's from the original restaurants of Lyon that used to advertise that you could leave your horse to be brushed down.
Bon vivant is another word that we should probably do an episode on Navigating the French, but it means, so it's directly translated to like good liver, but it's that sort of food-loving, wine-loving,
life-loving.
Okay, awesome. So we have this sort of roadside inn situation that now still exists in Lyon. And I think, you know, I'm going to lay myself down as the sacrificial lamb here because I will admit, and I know that I'm going to get a lot of hate from people from Lyon for this. When I first saw a bouchon, my first instinct was, oh, this looks like sort of the Lyonnais answer to a bistro.
Yeah, Lyonnais answer to a bistro, or even you coming from Paris, a Lyonnais answer to the bouillon.
Which we discussed on a previous episode of this podcast with Alison Zinder. So, I mean, we can do a quick, that's sort of a working class.
And it does make sense, Emily, because when you go up to, you know, all the different regions of France, the major cities and places that were big trading posts all have their local little restaurants. For example, in Alsace in Strasbourg, we have the Weinstube. Okay. And this is a restaurant that comes from the tradition that they would only heat one room in a house. And this was the place where they would welcome travelers and visitors. And it's the same ambiance. It's that little restaurant serving local specialties. And, wherever you go, you will find these little local restaurants. It's an interesting subject to explore when you're driving around the country.
Absolutely.
You, Emily.
Oh, me. Yes.
Wind blowing through your hair, you will become the contemporary Kornansky of France.
Oh, yes. The contemporary Kornansky with longer, curlier, wilder hair. That's me.
Oh, yeah. Going to all those little nooks and crannies and places where people haven't really had a chance to even think about the kind of things that you think about when it comes to gastronomy.
And I love thinking about those things and eating all of the things.
Right.
Well, actually, speaking of eating all the things, we're talking about a restaurant. We're talking about this sort of ambiance. But what does the menu of a Bouchon usually look like? Does it have sort of typical dishes that you would expect to find?
Yes. In fact, this Bouchon, it's kind of like a word that represents not only this inn, but what it evolved to be. And that is a restaurant that serves the local specialties. So when we think about local specialties, we have a man named Kornansky to thank for that. He was someone who, between the wars, he had a wonderful job. He was riding around France on a chauffeur-driven roadster and eating. And his job, which actually became his sort of raison d'être, was to chronicle his discoveries as he worked his way through the nooks and crannies of the countryside. And these are places that previously hadn't had access to the railways. These were sometimes isolated communities, places where oftentimes they were still referring to the local dishes in their old patois, in the old languages that existed before French was imposed. So he would write in his Paris chronicles about these multisyllabic, exotic-sounding dishes, present them to the public. And what it really was honest, simple peasant food. And he was redefining, or actually even inventing, a modern concept of French regional cuisine. Because before his regional cuisine, we didn't really have a whole lot of information. There were a lot of gray areas. The references referred to emblematic dishes that referred to, that were representing large swaths of the countryside. So he was filling in all the little details.
And when in time are we with Kornansky?
So this is between the wars. This is in the earlier 20th century. And it's the time of the automobile. This was when restaurants and going to restaurants as a destination and touring in automobiles became a really important factor of the French appreciation of regional cuisines. So Kornansky had a major effect on the Lyonnais Bouchon in that he basically hammered a nail into a tradition that existed in Lyon already, but he basically just said, this is what Lyon is now. And so when he came to Lyon, this was in the 1930s, he was the one who declared Lyon to be the gastronomic capital of the world. And part of that was his appreciation of the fact that Lyon had a very strong subculture of this bon vivant subculture of people really enjoying themselves in these restaurants called a Bouchon that was serving dishes that represented a different class from your average traveling merchant or the bourgeois or people who were, more wealthy. It was a series of dishes that represented the working class. So these were the people who were making the silk in Lyon.
Okay, so this is also how we're getting this unique connection to Lyon as well, because obviously, as you mentioned, every city, every region is going to have its working class food. But in Lyon, we have this very specific silk workers kind of society, I guess, kind of
right.
Community.
Exactly. You have this community. It's this underpinning of local culture. Okay. And this is also tied in with things that we can kind of trace back through from Lyon's printing traditions. There were people in Lyon, very flamboyant characters in Lyon. and their work was being published here and kind of handed out in pamphlets and sold at the local fairs. For example, François Rabelais. So this was back in the 1500s, a good 300 years before these dishes appeared in the local Bouchon. We know that the dishes that are served in a Bouchon date after the French Revolution because they were a product of the reorganization of the silkworks in Lyon. So at the same time, you have this kind of body subculture that has been developing for hundreds of years where people really appreciate, well, there's this literary tradition in Lyon, and they had a kind of a culture that really appreciated irony and maybe misplaced jokes and a kind of rough and tumble kind of subculture that kind of found its place in the Lyon Bouchon.
I mean, that makes sense to me because isn't Lyon also home to the guignols, the puppets, like the Punch and Judy style?
Exactly. So this sort of slapstick comedy, this local lore, the history, the puppets, the puerile humor, a lot of, just off-color humor that people, mainly men, would appreciate.
Sure.
This kind of thing existed in these restaurants. This was part of the culture of these restaurants. It was a place where you could go and just kind of let loose and laugh at a sick joke. It was a place where you could go into the restaurant and you can order these dishes that are basically named to make fun of the people who are actually eating in the restaurants, which are the traveling merchants, the heads of the workshops. So, for example, they'll serve a dish called caviar de la Croix-Rousse. Croix-Rousse is the hill where they were making the silk. And caviar, obviously, we know what that means. But what it is lentils with vinaigrette. So they're saying, okay, this is our caviar.
Okay.
And then you can get something that they call a saladier lyonnais. And this is not to be confused with the salade lyonnaise.
Okay.
So a saladier is a selection of yummy, meaty things. There are no vegetables in a saladier lyonnais. There's one called a salade au museau. It's a bunch of little things on a plate. So you've got salade au museau, which is, if you think about the word museau, it's the muzzle. It's a little bit like head cheese.
Mm-hmm.
And it's beef, and it's sliced thin and tossed in a vinaigrette. And then you have a salade de pied de veau, which is the tendon from the veal trotters. And that's slowly cooked until it's chewy. And then they slice it up thin again, and they toss that in a mayonnaise. You might get a house version of the Burgundian jambon persillé, because, Lyon falls on the southern tip of Burgundy. So you get some of this Burgundy flowing into the selection. And then, of course, the sausages of Lyon. There are traditions around sausage, and these were all served up in the Bouchon. There's one called the rosette, which is pork sausage. And then, the other dried sausages that might be flavored with other things and made with other parts of the boyau, that, like the casings, are coming from different parts of the digestive system of the pork. So, meaty stuff. But they're calling it a saladier.
Okay.
So when you're looking at, like, for example, this salade lyonnaise, it would be a really good idea. If you're interested in learning about the salade lyonnaise, you should read Anne Ma's Mastering the Art of French Eating.
That book is literally sitting right next to me right now.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah,
Read the chapter. She came to Lyon. She did extensive research. It was really interesting to see, how she discovered the salade lyonnaise. So I totally recommend just getting that book and reading that chapter. It's fun. And you can also get another sausage that they wrapped in brioche, and it's quite delicious. It's one of those things that's a little bit more tame on your menu as an entree.
As compared to what I ordered the first time I went to a Bouchon in Lyon, which was andouillette, which I love. And I think I might be the only American in the world who unironically loves it. But
well, I love it too.
Okay, excellent. Yes.
And andouillette lyonnaise is not pork like we find in the city of Troyes. You can get andouillette de Troyes, and it's not made of pork. And there's something that makes it special in Lyon, and it's that it's made from veal. And it's made from the fraise de veau, which is the just very beginning part of the small intestine. So it's not like these lower large intestine of pork that we're having in this sausage, but it's a much more refined andouillette. Well, in my opinion, it's just, it's a regional difference. And for some time we couldn't get the veal-based andouillette because there were years where certain parts of the beef couldn't be sold because of the mad cow situation. But now it's back. I mean, it's been back for a few years now. And so they had to kind of adjust to that. In Lyon, they quietly adjusted to having to use pork in their andouillette or sourcing pork andouillette. And now it's back to the traditional veal. So I recommend that you try it. I mean, I think it's delicious.
I do too. And usually, I mean, when I had it at the Bouchon in Lyon, it came with this like really rich mustard sauce. So there's like some spice, there's some creaminess, and you drink it with a glass of Beaujolais and life is good.
Exactly.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Paris: A State of Mind, where real estate experts Gail and Marie give you all the tips and tricks you need about renting and buying apartments in Paris and beyond. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
We've got tablier de sapeur.
Ooh, what's that?
So tablier de sapeur is a slab of beef tripe. Okay. And, the cow has 4 different stomachs. So it's the one that's flat, and they call it the name is escaping me, but it's the flat one. And it doesn't have a whole lot of different textures. It's just this big slab of beef tripe. And they will marinate that with wine or other things, for example, mustard. And then they will bread that and fry it. And they serve that with a sauce gribiche. So a sauce gribiche is a mayonnaise made with hard-boiled egg yolks and mustard and, like a neutral oil. And then they add pickles and capers and fine herbs, parsley, chives, chervil, sorry.
No gerbils.
No, chervil. So in addition to that, you're going to probably see riz de veau on a Bouchon menu appearing in different forms. Sometimes it will be featured in a salad. Sometimes it's served on its own with a cream sauce.
And this is veal sweetbreads.
And that's veal sweetbread. So we have veal represented all over the place, from the beginning of the meal to the main course. And then also, of course, we have the tête de veau. Have you ever had the tête de veau?
So I've had tête de veau in my life, but not at a Bouchon. But I actually I was meant to live in France. I love urban meats. Actually, the only one I have a hard time with is straight tripe. And it's only because of the texture, the honeycomb texture I find weird. But everything else I'm into.
But a lot of times this sauce will come into play because tripe was meant to soak up the sauces, right? Mm-hmm. So you'll get, oftentimes you can see like a tripe served with we see this at the local tripier. They do their own version of it. It's in this tomato and white wine sauce. And it's really quite good. And it's cooked so much that you're not really getting this whole, like chewy texture thing going on with it. Yeah. So the tête de veau, that was what scared me when I first came to Lyon. 22 years ago, I was a, 30-something aged youngster. And I go into a restaurant and I'm like, tête de veau, what is that? And, my husband's like, it is the head of the veal.
Well, of course it is.
You got to be kidding me. So I was like imagining that it was going to come out on this head was going to come out on this platter, surrounded by black candles and like people chants coming in like this weird sort of seance. But no, it was lovely. It's a little slice. They take everything that's not edible from the tête de veau and they tie it up like a roast. And then it's going to be simmered for 5 or 6 hours until it's completely soft. And then they slice it thin, or sometimes you can get maybe like half an inch slice. And they're going to serve that with a sauce ravigote or gribiche. And then you'll get, steamed vegetables to kind of temper all of these different flavors. So you've got this incredible umami coming from the tête de veau. because the texture is so silky and delicious. And then you have, these sharp flavors coming from the sauce, and then these steamed vegetables to just kind of balance it all out. And that's definitely my favorite dish. And it's one that I will go for. Sometimes I just can't help myself. I just keep ordering it over and over again.
I mean, it sounds amazing. And it also, I think, kind of highlights, the vibe you're getting from the menus of a lot of these Bouchons, which, as you mentioned, and I think this is really important. I want to sort of refocus on it because we talked about it, but I think we can hang out in this area again, because when you're talking about Kernonsky kind of solidifying sort of blocking the menu based on what his experience was, I think when you were talking about regional French cooking, I think this is something that as outsiders, as Americans looking at the world of French cooking, we don't think about enough, especially now in 2022, which is that for such a long time, when we said French cooking in France, it was Parisian cooking and it was fine dining cooking.
Mm-hmm. It was what was codified. It was what
Right.
was codified by Carême and then eventually Escoffier. It was what the references were telling us it was.
Yeah. And when we're talking about, we talk about Carême and Escoffier, these, Escoffier specifically was a military man who codifies French cooking. And so it's this fine dining French cooking and the regional cuisines kind of remain outliers. I mean, in the way that
exactly
France is unified, we become unified much earlier than Italy does, for example. But at the same time, there's still all these little pockets of regional language and regional cooking. And we don't really, as you mentioned, start to focus on them in depth until, I remember I was speaking with this culinary historian, Patrick Rambourg, who's a, total expert in sort of the history of French cooking. And he was talking about how during World War I, rather, there were still, I'm not sure I'm attributing it to the right person, but I digress. There were still generals who realized that their soldiers couldn't communicate with each other because their languages were so different. And that went down to the cooking as well. So when we have,
Exactly. And once you get to the 1930s, for example, when people are actually starting to circulate, 20s and 30s, people are circulating in automobiles into these places where people are still speaking in the old patois and referring to the food. That's basically where it continued to exist just for the longest time, was in the food. You had people it was a whole new thing. There was a tire company that came up with their marketing scheme to get people to take a trip off the beaten path. And they came out with their list of places that were worth a trip off the beaten path. And that's how the Michelin Guide started. And then we also have Kernonsky, who had, carved a name for himself in that he was basically the person who invented the modern institution of French regional cuisine. Because that was his mission, was to go out there and to find all these little dishes. And it was fascinating. So we've got regional cuisine on one side, and then we've got, the feutré, the hushed cuisine bourgeoise on the other side.
So this is when he's kind of anchoring it in time and bringing it out into mettre en relief. I don't like highlighting it.
Right. He's highlighting it as that's his job, but he's also just completely bluffé. He's completely fascinated and entranced with this local culture in Lyon, where there's a fair share of exaggeration, irony, the grotesque, satire. And it's all represented in this repertoire of dishes that are served in a bouchon. So, this inherent spirit of the bon vivant, alive and well in the bouchon, with dishes that are not only interesting and delicious, but layer upon layer of tricks with words and tales and lore, jokes, irony, satire, da-da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah, like another one of those dishes that you were talking about, the ones with this joke, is one of my favorites, which is cervelle de
canut.
De canut.
Yep. So this is where we get into the cheese course. We've got cervelle de canut, which is literally translates to silk workers' brains. And so you're sitting down in a restaurant and you're like, okay, I have a choice between the local cheese Saint-Marcellin or cervelle de canut.
And bearing in mind you've just eaten veal's head, that's not so far-fetched, right?
Exactly.
But there are no brains.
So what that is it's fresh cheese, yesterday's cheese, the one that they just made yesterday. They've drained it off and they put shallots and sometimes a little bit of garlic and fresh herbs. And it's delicious. It's refreshing. It's a beautiful, refreshing end to the meal. But the name itself is kind of vulgar in a way.
Totally. Well, I think that reflects, just that sort of spirit that you were talking about. Now I have a double-barreled question for you.
Oh, yes.
So first is, we've talked about when the Bouchon was sort of protected and highlighted and sort of becomes defined by an outsider, which I think is something that it just sort of locks it in time almost. First of all, when did Bouchons actually start? And then today, what is the state of the Bouchon almost 100 years after Kernansky? Is it still what it always was, this working class restaurant, or is it, which what I'm finding is happening with bistros in Paris right now, more like a museum to itself?
So, when did Bouchon get their start? That is a question that is frustratingly difficult to actually reveal. From all the research that I've been able to do, I haven't really been able to say, okay, well, this was the first Bouchon. There is no actual proof of anything. But you have creation myths that have little by little started flowering in published works that start in the 1930s. And they're just, they're kind of like, oh, yes, they started as a place where the different classes would mix together. And then somebody else picks that up and says, yeah, who was the different classes? So that must have been the silk workers and the wealthy merchants were sitting at the same table. And then you've got all these things going on, and you're very unlikely things given the rigidity of the way that French culture has always existed. And then, like vague references to the bouchon, the bundle of straw. And, if you look at the dishes in a bouchon, one thing is very clear, that they did not exist before the French Revolution.
Interesting.
Why? Because they are a product of the reorganization of the silk works. They were not having communal meals. These silk workers, people involved in the making of the silk, the head of the workshops, the traders, the workers, the salariés, the employees, they were not having communal meals before their whole operation was built on the hill of the Croix Rousse. It was a garden before the revolution. It was church land, and this land was appropriated, and they built the silkworks, the modern silkworks in Lyon after the revolution. So all of these dishes, like cervelle de Canu and caviar de la Croix Rousse, things like that, they came from that phenomenon. They came from the fact that the silkworks were consolidated on this hill. And that postdates the fact that we had these inns where you could leave your horse for the night in Lyon. The trading, the fairs and festivals where people could trade without paying tax existed for hundreds of years before the silkworks found their way to the Croix Rousse Hill. So when did Bouchons get their start? I would say, you always had sort of, like with the onset of restaurants, these inns that would welcome traveling merchants. And then at the same time, you have these dishes that were being enjoyed by the population of the silkworks in what they called a machon, which was their morning meal, and it consisted of these dishes. So I think it predates the silkworks when you think about this, if you accept the premise that they're named after, there's this synecdoche created by this little bundle of straw outside of the inn, meaning that the restaurant is called a bouchon because it has a little bundle of straw outside. But then again, the dishes that were served are represented by what was being served in the mid to late 1800s. So yeah, when did they get their start? Hard to say. It's murky. There's a lot of lore and storytelling around the history, but trying to pin it down is not as easy as you might think.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Don't Miss This, which will clue you into some of the most interesting events happening in Paris right now. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
And what was the other part of your double-barreled question?
Well, you've kind of paved the way wonderfully into the answer, which is a Bouchon today? When you go to Lyon, obviously there are still Bouchons, and I think there's an association recognizing which ones are real Bouchons and which ones aren't. But are they still do they still have that bon vivant quality? Is it still a place where you can go and tell off-color jokes? Or is it more in the way that I think a lot of bistros are in Paris, more like a museum to this way of life that still exists and you can still eat wonderfully?
The culture in these restaurants is still different.
Okay.
You're going to get served generally by the owner of the place or someone who's posing as the owner, like with a very authoritative attitude. You're going to get a kind of no-nonsense brusqueness to the transaction. You know, when they bring the food to the table, they're kind of saying, we don't really care much about what people might think. And they're slapping the food down in a way that's a little bit surprising. And you're like, okay, yeah, I'm in the middle of something different. Okay. And so there's that culture. And it's often done tongue in cheek. It's not like an aggressive, mean sort of service, but it does have a brusqueness to it that contrasts with these old traditions that you see in French service. You know, they take their profession quite seriously in France. The art of table service is codified, and it is something that people take, you know, very seriously. And in the Bouchon, there's that contrast from this hushed proficiency. That's the pride in French service. And that contrast is quite prominent. So you're going to see also these rich layers of lore and history, sometimes kind of put together after the fact. Photos of famous people, Lyonnais ephemera, little souvenirs of things that you can only just sit there and wonder where that came from. Like little cartoons with naked ladies in them. And you know, that's part of the whole thing too. It's a culture that's done on purpose. It's meant to follow with the tradition. The tradition goes back a really long time. I mean, it's the basis of the whole thing goes way back. But at the same time, now in modern times, you can't help but be a little bit skeptical about, you know, like, how real is this?
Yeah.
You know, it's a local institution, and they're following along with these institutional aspects of the culture of the restaurant that were, you know, pretty much hammered down by Kornansky, but also by these associations and people that have made it their point to protect the culture of the Bouchon. But it is an interesting and valid question, Emily, to ask if it is a caricature of itself now.
Well, I mean, I think it's a really fascinating aspect of French cuisine, especially as an American, you know, looking at this sort of protectionist mindset that we have. I mean, I think about it all the time with AOPs and AOCs. I'm sure you do too. Like, the French have this desire to protect the ancestral heritage sort of cuisine. And it's so funny because I mentioned that to, and this I am definitely citing the right person, Patrick Rambourg, and said, you know, oh, well, the inscription of the French gastronomic meal into the UNESCO Intangible World Heritage is sort of the French trying to protect their meal. And he's like, absolutely not. No, that means that we don't want it to evolve. And of course we do. And I understand that. But I think I'm going to stand my ground here. First of all, because I then immediately after went to the Cité de la Gastronomie in Dijon and saw that there was an expo on the UNESCO thing, and it says to protect, you know, it's about
exactly.
protecting.
And it's all about protection.
Yeah.
I mean, as somebody who, like, I went through this whole process of becoming a pâtissière in France, and it was because I wasn't allowed to make pastry and sell it if I didn't have the professional certification to be a French pastry chef. And so I went through that whole, like, what the hell and why is this going on? Like, why are they being so protective of French pastry? And since the time that I went through that whole process, things have changed a little bit. We're seeing a lot of different cultures represented in pastry. American pastry is like all the rage.
Les cookies, les brownies.
Brownie. There was a whole cupcake thing about 10 years ago that fizzled out.
Now it's the donuts.
Yep, we've got donuts. We've got... What was the other American thing I saw just the other day? Somebody was making a layer cake.
Oh.
Where this is like the brand new thing in France to have these layer cakes. But at the same time, I was told at the time that I could not sell any pastry that used the following ingredients. It was just rigid. And I thought to myself, my God, why? And then I realized after I actually started learning the French repertoire in pâtisserie, which was a mind-blowing and life-changing experience for me, especially as a teacher, I realized it's pretty amazing. The history of French pastry, it's one of those things that hasn't changed. We have evolution in the history of French cuisine in general, that, basically the code was broken with La Cuisine Nouvelle, and that opened the floodgates to all kinds of innovation and change in French cuisine. But when it comes to pastry, the traditions are very old.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can go and find, that if there's a pastry shop that's selling their religieuse, that they're going to have the classic flavors of chocolate and coffee. And if you want anything else, you're going to have to order it. There are different levels of pastry chefs where they're allowed to be creative. Once you become a milieu ouvrier de France, you have that possibility to actually create new flavors. But when you're going to your average neighborhood pastry shop, it's coffee and chocolate. So, it is interesting how they spend a great deal of energy protecting the old traditions.
All right, I'm going to ask you to put on Kernonsky's driving gloves for a moment. For those of us who are not in Lyon, can you paint us a verbal picture of your favorite Bouchon in Lyon, and what, if you were very hungry and you were going to order everything, first of all, you walk in, what does it look like? And secondly, what is your ideal Bouchon meal going to contain?
Okay, so the first thing that you're going to notice when you walk into a Bouchon, the decor, we've got, those layers of local lore. We've got the puerile humor. We've got the cartoons. We've got the owner standing in the corner. He's usually hanging out at the comptoir, which is a bar where they have the local wines on tap. And this is a place where you're probably going to pay your bill before you leave. The lighting is going to be anything from bare fluorescent bars to cozy little individual lamps on the tables. It really is just going to depend on how they decide to decorate that way. One feature that you pretty much always see are these red or pink check tablecloths. You'll have that different culture. You're going to have the slapping the plates down on the table. You're going to have this list of dishes that's a little bit odd and different to you. And so if I went into my favorite Bouchon, and I'm saying, okay, my favorite Bouchon is, and I've always said this because it was probably about 14 years ago, I did this research into taking pictures of dishes coming off the pass in this whole list of Bouchon. And I realized that very few of the Bouchon today, or even, 14 years ago, were fully staffed with an entire staff in the kitchen. They were usually reheating stuff. And this whole tradition of the traiteur, you talked about the traiteur at one point as being the precursor to restaurants. It's very strong in the Bouchon. So, for example, even the most celebrated chef in the history of French cuisine right up to the end of the 20th century would never make her own quenelles Lyonnais. She ordered them.
Which is like a choux pastry base with pike in it, right? Fish?
Well, it's a panade, which is a little bit more dense than a choux pastry. But if you're doing them yourself at home, you can do something like quite a dry choux pastry. And then you're going to incorporate lots of eggs and butter and this pike fish, which is a bony fish that they run through a drum sieve and just get the meat part. And they incorporate this. And it's a little bit like a souffle. So when it comes to the table, it sort of settles down into its own after it starts to cool down a little bit. And it's served with a sauce nantois, which is a crawfish sauce.
I love it so much. I could eat that sauce on a choux.
Oh, yeah. It makes everything wonderful. And actually, the quenelles are very good because they've just got a ton of butter in them. And, the fish and butter, how can you go wrong? So that's something that you order if you're not ready to, kind of launch yourself into the tête de veau or the tripe-based dishes. So anyway, there's a lot of outsourcing that takes place. And there are institutions in Lyon, just like the Bouchon, that are supplying many of these restaurants with what they're serving. And there's only a few places that are doing everything from A to Z, from scratch. One of those is Café Comptoir Abel, and another one is the one that I like to take my friends to, and that is Danielle et Denise in their prefecture location. They have several different restaurants now, but the original restaurant is where all the magic is happening. So I will go there. I'm not going to be tempted by whatever special they're offering, and I'm going to go with the good old, maybe I'll start with a salad with veal sweetbreads. And then I will, and they do a very good job with that. They're fried and they're just the right, it's just perfect. And then I'll go with that tête de veau.
Amazing. And then are you getting cheese?
Of course. So it's between the Saint-Marcellin and the Cervelle de Canu. And, I like to have a proper cheese. Cervelle de Canu is delicious. I love it. I will eat it on bread. But at the end of the meal, I'm kind of in the mood for like a proper cheese. So I'm going to go with the Saint-Marcellin. And for dessert, maybe a tarte aux pralines or île flottante, which is general French. But it's made special at Danielle et Denise by the fact that they use the praline lyonnaise in there.
Which is a pink praline.
Exactly. So these are the candied almonds that have that red color.
Well, it sounds delicious. Now we're all salivating. So everybody's going to have to go to Lyon and take a cooking class with Lucy, take a market class, learn even more about the local history and the local lore. Where can folks find you in the meantime, while they're building up their appetites to come to Lyon? Are you on social media?
I am. I'm on Instagram. And that's basically where most of my social media comes in. I don't really, Instagram is it.
We'll put it in the show notes. We'll put your Instagram and we'll put your website as well.
Yeah, the website's where you can contact me and you can also sign up for a class.
Amazing. I'm sure that we're going to have a lot of hungry folks wanting to come and to learn how to make all of these local specialties. Do you teach many of these sort of offal-based specialties in your cooking classes, or are you doing mostly...
Well, it always depends on the group.
Okay.
And we do have a lot of people who are in Lyon. They really want to try it. There are people who will privatize a class and will do a game class or specifically these kinds of things. We try to work in a little tasting of some of the local specialties that are available from the tripier or another traiteur that might have like typically Lyonnais things. But basically what we're doing is we're looking at what's best at the market that day and cooking from that with, the group decides what to cook. It veers toward like the products from the tripier from time to time, but not all the time.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I feel like we've only just barely scratched the surface. So
I know you need to come down here.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Thank you so much for joining me and have an amazing rest of your day.
Oh, thank you, Emily. It was great to talk to you.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.